What if everything we saw in Deep Space Nine wasn't about Starfleet, or politics, or war? What if the Dominion War was just a distraction? What if it was a crucible, a divine manipulation? And what if the prophets, the gods of Bajor, didn't save anyone except themselves? The prophets exist outside of time. They see past, present, and future all at once. To them, there is no becoming, only being. And in their being, they saw something coming. A threat, a fire, a war they could not ignore. And so, they acted. Not with fleets, not with weapons, but with whispers, possession, and plans so deep, mortals would mistake them for coincidence. They didn't wait for the war. They designed it. And their first move was a child. Benjamin Sisko was never just a man. He was a weapon, a prophecy, a divine tool forged in flesh. And his story doesn't begin with love, but with possession. Prophets didn't bless Sarah Sisko. They infested her. They took her body, her mind, her voice, and through her, they seduced Joseph Sisko.
Sarah and I were married for 2 years. She seemed very happy. I certainly was.
A loving man caught in a divine lie. He didn't fall in love with Sarah. He fell in love with a mask. The prophets didn't care. They didn't explain, didn't comfort, didn't ask forgiveness. Because to them, Sarah was never a person. She was a vessel. A line of code and a script they'd already seen. Benjamin Sisko wasn't chosen. He wasn't manufactured, not born from destiny, but from violation. The wormhole didn't open until Sisko arrived. Was it chance, or was it prophecy? That one moment reshaped Bajor, really reshaped the Alpha and Beta quadrants, and put everything in motion. But that wormhole wasn't just a discovery. It was a doorway, a gateway, a battleground. And the prophets weren't interested in peace. They were preparing for war. Like all gods, they moved through influence, through dreams, through silence, and like all tacticians, they placed their pawns. And then there was Kira, the faithful soldier, the child of occupation. She believed in the prophets, and her faith never wavered. They didn't give her peace, they gave her struggle. She fought, she bled, she lost friends. And each loss deepened her resolve. Each trial strengthened her devotion. She didn't love Sisko because of who he was, but because of what he represented. The emissary, the voice of the prophets, the living symbol of her belief. She followed him, protected him, carried his mission, even when it cost her. She wasn't their weapon. She was their witness, the one who watched the pawns move and still chose to believe. Then came Vedek Bareil, peaceful, disciplined, compassionate. He could have led Bajor, he could have become Kai, and he could have become more. But the prophets didn't choose him. They allowed him to die. Or worse, they allowed Wynn to live. Bareil became a sacrifice, not for Bajor, but for the path the prophets preferred. Faithful, loyal, expendable. The prophets rarely gave commands. They didn't share plans. They simply placed each soul in motion and watched. The wormhole didn't just change the quadrant, it activated the board. Then came the Dominion, cold, calculated, led by founders who saw themselves as gods, just like the prophets. The founders created the Dominion to impose order, a perfect system, rigid, controlled, absolute. They reshaped species, engineered obedience, erased identity and choice. They demanded loyalty, and when it faltered, they punished it. There was no love, only fear, only service. The prophets were different, but not better. They didn't command, they manipulated. They gave visions, they gave silence. They let mortals interpret mystery as meaning. They didn't erase choice, they shaped it. The founders and prophets, two sides of the same divine coin. One ruled through control, the other through faith, both intolerant of deviation, both demanding obedience. The founders forced their followers to act. The prophets let their followers believe it was their idea. And through it all, the war marched on. When Bajor faced annihilation, the prophets acted. Once. They erased a Dominion fleet. Without violence, without effort, without warning. But only once. After that, they stayed silent. For years. Through occupation, through bloodshed, through betrayal. Until it suited them to return. Until Sisko was ready. Until the fire had burned hot enough. They didn't save the Alpha Quadrant. Starfleet did. They didn't win the war. They waited it out. Because the war was never the point. It was just the fire they needed to burn everything that stood in the way of their design. The founders ruled with control. The prophets ruled with faith. But this chapter is about the man caught between gods. This is about Sisko. The war didn't just scar him, it shaped him. It broke the man he was and forged the one they needed. The prophets gave him purpose, but the Dominion War gave him shape. It taught him what the prophets would not. Loss, command, the weight of choosing who dies. Sisko watched friends fall, enemies win. He buried people he loved, he broke promises. He made decisions no Starfleet captain should make. He lied. Sisko falsified evidence, tricked an empire into war. He let Garrick commit murder, and he stayed silent, because it had to be done. And when it was over, he ultimately said, I can live with it. The prophets said nothing. When he did right, they said nothing. When he did wrong, they said nothing. Not because they were absent, but because they were waiting. Waiting for him to break. Waiting for him to choose. Waiting for the fire to purify the still. He was born to become the emissary. And through these trials, he became it. Not through visions, not through prophecy, but through war. Through pain, through guilt, through choice. He buried Jadzia and walked away from the prophets. Not out of disbelief, but grief. Even then, they said nothing, because silence was their tool. They would ultimately intervene, and they would ultimately guide, but in the end, they let the fire do their work. The prophets didn't forge him with miracles, they forged him with war. The Dominion War was not a mistake. It was not a tragedy the prophets failed to prevent. It was a crucible, a slow, deliberate fire lit by divine hands. And Benjamin Sisko was steel placed inside. They didn't guide the battles. They didn't end the suffering. They let it burn. Because every casualty, every betrayal, every scar shaped the man they needed him to become. He was always born to be the emissary. He was shaped into it. Not by faith, not by prophecy, but ultimately by the war. The prophets never raised armies, they raised him. And when Bajor stood on the edge of destruction, they didn't save the world. They unleashed the weapon they had forged. Not a captain, not a prophet, but something in between. Because in the end, the Dominion wasn't the enemy. The Pah-Wraiths were. The war, the silence, the visions, all of it was preparation for that battle. For the gods to defeat their rivals. They needed a mortal, one who had seen death, one who could choose to act. They didn't want a follower, they wanted a weapon. And in the end, they got one. The war is over, but Sisko's story is only just beginning. Because the prophets won, and no one ever asked if they deserved to.